Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here, really, among colleagues from Europe and America. In 1893, Anders Zorn visited the United States for the first time. He felt at home immediately. He enjoyed the American lifestyle and he appreciated the openness and sincerity of the people. Their frank, straightforward manner appealed to me, he wrote in his autobiography. When an American says he's all right, all doors open to the foreigner, and that's something European cannot understand. At this time, Zorn was at the peak of his international career. With his portraiture, he had found a style, refined, elegant, sophisticated, that won great popularity among wealthy people, not at least here in America, where businessmen, politicians, and their wives were willing to pay astronomical sums to have their portraits painted by him. Life in America is 4 times more expensive than in Sweden, Zorn wrote to his wife, so I asked for 4 times the price for my pictures. The Swede was drawn into a fashionable upper-class society, so far from his humble origins as could be. From a social point of view, Zorn's career in the United States is amazing, but the fact that he could enjoy the company of Americans and appreciate their mentality was not so strong, so strange. After all, he himself was a self-made man, the very symbol of the American dream. Zorn was born in 1860 and grew up in humble circumstances in the small village of Mora in the center of Sweden, Dalarna. His father was a German brewer, Leonard Zorn, who his mother had met during a seasonal work in the city of Uppsala. They never married. The boy lived with his mother and maternal grandparents on their small farm. When the father passed away in 1872, without ever having seen his son, a small inheritance improved the boy's future prospects. 15 years old, he could enter the Royal Swedish Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm. Zorn's artistic breakthrough came with the watercolor In Morning, which was exhibited at the Academy's student show in 1880. The year after, a conflict with the Academy director resulted in him dropping out to go his own way to secure a future for himself. That future included plans to marry a girl he had just met, Emma Lam. They were the same age but had completely different backgrounds. She belonged to an upper middle-class Jewish family from Stockholm. The couple was secretly engaged, but a wedding would depend on whether or not Zorn could make a success of himself in the world. At the age of 21, Zorn went to Spain. From Seville, he writes to his future brother-in-law, "It is hot and sunny here, with nice girls and picturesque beggars, a paradise for painters. It should damn well be in Paris and just look what others have done." 6 months in the south resulted in the maturing of his artistic talent and a portfolio filled with pictures of velvet-eyed Spanish women, his favorite motive. One watercolor, The Cousins, painted in Cadiz, was accepted for the Paris Salon in 1882 and gave Zorn his first international recognition. The picture shows the young daughter of Ramon Rodriguez Barcaza, a painter professor at the Cadiz Art Academy, together with her cousin. Zorn has skillfully used the medium's entire register, from the concentration of black pigment and details in the girls' faces and hair, where he produced the right sheen with the help of the Indian ink, to the light as a feather glazes in the textiles. He further demonstrates his virtuosity by allowing the paint to run over the paper here and there in blotches. According to some critics, however, Zorn's ability to make painting appear effortless and was perceived as affected and a sign of nonchalance. After Spain, Zorn went to London. He set himself up as in an expensive studio on Brook Street and used credit to equip himself and purchase first-class art materials. Zorn understood that a respectable appearance, an elegant studio, and a good manner were crucial factors in establishing himself in the big city. And it wasn't long until he received his first commissions. One of his clients was a wealthy young American, Clarence Barker, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. In a letter to his fiancée, Zorn explains the idea behind the picture. Clarence Barker, he writes, reclines comfortably on the divan, having just spent some time gazing at his sweetheart's portrait, and he now casts a tender glance at his dog, which stands over him and looks him wonderingly in the eye. The painting could be called Rivals. It wouldn't take long, however, before Zorn completely abandoned the anecdotal aspect of his pictures. In parentheses, it can be mentioned that Clarence Barker passed away just 11 years later at the Vanderbilt Biltmore Estates in North Carolina. At that time, another of Zorn's paintings was hanging in the drawing room at Biltmore, The Waltz, which Clarence's cousin, George Vanderbilt, had bought 3 years earlier. Zorn had also painted Clarence's sister, Virginia, better known as Mrs. Walter Bacon, and did it again 1897 in a portrait owned by Metropolitan Museum here in New York. Intentionally or not, on that day in London, Clarence Barker had opened the door for Zorn to one of the wealthiest families in America. In the spring 1884, Zorn left London's fog and darkness behind and headed to Spain for the second time in his life, as the Swedish minister in Madrid had raised the possibility of some prestigious commissions. The minister arranged an audience for Zorn with the king's secretary, Count Morphy. He promised Zorn that he could paint the king's portrait and would provide times for the sitting at a later date. Meanwhile, the Count himself took the opportunity to commission a portrait of his young daughter, Cristina. This portrait, which belongs to the Prado in Madrid, became one of Zorn's most radiant portraits of the 1880s. By mixing some white gouache with the water and painting the last layer slightly outside, Zorn creates a feeling of space and softness around the model, a trick he later mastered with even greater skill. In 1885, Zorn returned to Sweden to marry his fiancée, Emma. During the first years, the young couple were traveling a lot in Europe and North Africa. In Constantinople, Zorn painted the Caique Oarsman, which exists in 4 versions. As a passenger in the narrow skiff, Zorn saw the oarsman from the boat's stern in a strongly shortened perspective. He depicts the force of the motion, how the oarsman leans back, gripping the oars firmly, pushing back with his feet on what seems to be the actual frame of the painting. The watercolor is essentially quite different from other artworks at the late 19th century that portray the Orient in romantic, exotic ways. Zorn's interest is in the scene itself, in the reflections of the water and the mother-of-pearl shimmering atmosphere of the city of the Bosporus. The summers, the young couple normally spent on an island in Stockholm archipelago, where Emma's mother rented a small house. Zorn portrayed in watercolors the carefree days of the summer guests in the fashionable seaside resort. Their first summer as newlyweds, 1886, resulted in some of his most exquisite pictures in this setting, like this one, Summer Vacation. It shows his wife on a jetty, maybe preparing herself for the challenging step down in the rowing boat. In his autobiography, Zorn writes, "What seems now to have particularly attracted me was the play of the water and the reflections, to really get the movement, put the ripples and everything in perspective, and scientifically explain it all with sharpness." The sea would become a recurring motive in Zorn's pictures, not only the coves of Stockholm's archipelago, but also the rivers in Yorkshire, England, the harbour of Hamburg with its steam and soot and fog, and the wild waves of the Atlantic Ocean, painted from the ship between United States and Europe. In the autumn of 1887, the Zorns traveled to Cornwall on England's southwest coast. In the village of St. Ives, they found a genuine and attractive fishing setting, and in addition, an international colony of painters. Their visit proved a turning point in Zorn's artistic development. Inspired by his fellow artists, he now began to paint in oil. One of his first paintings was a portrait of his wife reading. Another painting, called Fisherman in St. Ives, was acquired by the French state. Zorn could later claim, "This, my debut in oil, was indeed very successful." From that year on, Paris was Zorn's hometown. During 8 years, 71 Boulevard de Clichy in Montmartre remained their fixed address. Zorn's arrival coincided with an event of great magnitude, the World's Fair in 1889. Impressionism had by then achieved its definite breakthrough, and the fair was a victory for the new art in France. The Swedish delegation was also a great success. Zorn was one of the Swedes awarded a first-class medal and decorated with the most prestigious order in France, the Legion of Honor. At the age of just 29 years old, he had won a respectable place in the Parisian art world. Indeed, one can say that Zorn had a talent like Mozart and a career like Napoleon. Zorn took great interest in the new artistic movement in Paris. Like the Impressionists, he painted the natures and the world as he saw it in his own way. He also adapted his work to the motive which characterized Impressionism, such as contemporary street scenes, harbors, and theaters. And he used the same kind of compositions. The masterly Impression de Londres, or Impression of London, from 1889, one of his very last watercolor, is a fine example of his personal interpretation of the new style. Pictures like this of everyday life, without any epic story, certainly made some critics call him an impressionist. But a true impressionist, that is, in the French way, he wasn't. He didn't focus on the French impressionist extreme decomposition of colors. It is probably more accurate to call him a naturalist, with the exception being that the interpretations of motives did not include any criticism towards society. For some years, Zorn frequently switched from one painting technique to the other. The portrait of Rosita Mauri, famous dancer at the Paris Opera, is a watercolor in the flowering free style that was now fashion. On the other hand, when Rosita Mauri commissioned a portrait of a 60-year-old father, Monsieur Mauri, it was painted in oil. The former dancer sits on a high-backed chair with an arm hooked over the back. With his right hand he holds a hidden cigarette, from which the smoke forms the artist's signature in the upper right corner. In his portraits, Zorn worked to a high degree with the light. He divided the face in two halves and let the personalities of the different sides appear in both cases. When successful, Zorn would say he had made a character painting. This is one such painting. Eventually, oil painting took over completely. After all, it was the medium of the masters most admired by Zorn, Velázquez, and Rembrandt. Zorn's paintings often give a sense of improvisation, as if they were made without any effort at all. One explanation is that he genuinely mastered his art. For Zorn, art was to a high extent a craft. Another is his background as a watercolor painter. The picture was already finished in his mind when he transferred it into canvas. He always painted a prima vista, relaxed and focused at the same time, in order to achieve the right touch. A fellow artist of Zorn has described his way of working. It is not a paradox. When Zorn painted carefully, he painted quickly. Each brushstroke was precisely calculated before being executed. First, the hand described the necessary motion in the air, and then the stroke was performed with style and confidence. Despite alterations caused by the model's movements, Zorn never painted anything, not the least thing, haphazardly. End quote. The World's Fair 1889 was also a breakthrough for Zorn as an open-air painter. The public widely acclaimed his pictures of bathing women in the Stockholm archipelago. The motive with nudes in the open air was itself not new, as you know. It has a long tradition in Western art. Zorn's great contribution was disposing of the mythology and the artificial arrangement that had previously given the motive its alibi. He took the model away from the salon and the studio and placed her out in nature, ordinary, healthy, Nordic women who moved with grace among the rocky shorelines and trees. What Zorn tried to achieve was a synthesis of color where the water, the bodies and rocks reflected one another. Zorn's first trip to the United States was as a commissioner of the Swedish department at the Columbian World's Fair in Chicago, 1893. Together with Emma, he stayed for about 1 year. Here he became acquainted with Isabella Stewart Gardner, whom you know very well, from Boston. They first met when she purchased Zorn's omnibus, depicting a Parisian bus interior at the fair. She had made up her mind to buy omnibus while standing in front of it and asked, "Who is Zorn?" The artist introduced himself, and Mrs. Gardner remarked, "Oh my, I think we'll either be enemies quite soon or very, very good friends forever." They indeed did become good friends. Mrs. Gardner purchased several more works by the Swede, and the following year, in October 1894, Anders and Emma Zorn went to Venice to the Gardner's guests at Palazzo Barbaro. This is when Zorn made his famous portrait of his hostess. Zorn knew he had the right moment for his portrait when he witnessed her enter the salon from the balcony, exalted after watching some fireworks, and turned to her guests with outstretched arms. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Mrs. Gardner is incomparable to any of my clients, and it is not every day I can place my model against the Canal Grande." In the summer 1896, the Zorn moved back to Sweden and the Zorn house in Mora, which they had already started to build. But in no way did Zorn international contacts come to an end. Until the outbreak of the First World War, he was often traveling, usually in the spring. His last trip to America took place in 1911. He worked tirelessly, participated frequently in exhibitions, and continually received new commissions for portraits. In total, he painted more than 500 portraits, about 100 of them here in America, including 2 presidents, Grover Cleveland and William Taft. Zorn's success as an artist were not only based on his paintings, however, and watercolors. He was also a brilliant etcher. Rembrandt was his role model. By collecting and studying the grand old master's print, Zorn learned to achieve dramatic effects of light and shade with squalls of lines, and used these to create his own unorthodox impressionist style. During his career, Zorn made 290 different etchings, among them one of the French philosopher Ernest Gox, which you see here, one of his masterpieces, as well as that of the President Theodore Roosevelt. Like many of the old masters, Zorn was a versatile artist, not only painter and etcher, but also sculptor and designer. The small portraits of his grandmother that he carved in birch in around 1892, and about 6 inches high, is a fine proof of his skill with a knife, something he had learned at an early age. For Zorn, wood carving was not a tiresome task, it was a sort of therapy for his restless hands. Zorn always bore a great love for his hometown, and this depended even further when the move back to Mora. With the move back to Mora, his personality was a combination of the great man of the world and the child of nature from Mora, who liked simple, genuine, and sensual things. Now and then he went to his studio and fishing cabin in the wilderness, Gopsmore, on the shore of a river north of Mora, where he enjoyed an old-fashioned country lifestyle. In these restful surroundings, he made some of his most inspired paintings. Zorn's depictions of ordinary people from his native area show a static world, a culture that appeared to resist change. The basic mood in his work is always calm and gentle, and shows everyday subjects. He paints the herdsmaid in the forest, and the fiddler with his instrument. He paints the baking of flatbread in the cottage, girls occupied with various tasks, and of course, the midsummer celebrations, which he felt so strongly about. He portrays everything with respect and care. The pictures are always based on knowledge of objects, gained through his own experience and a phenomenal visual memory. Zorn came to combine his art with a heartfelt commitment to his home area. He provided inspiration, donated money, and collected objects, which contributed greatly to the preservation of folk culture, to music and to dance, woodwork and textile handicrafts. Regarding Mora's traditional dress, he was both its protector and innovator, and he often painted women wearing it. Despite his sometimes anti-intellectual sentiments, Zorn supported many initiatives in education. The foremost example was Mora's Folk High School, a kind of rural adult education, which was founded thanks to donations from him and Emma in 1907. Several years later, beside the school, he established an open-air museum that would give a picture of life in the district from days gone by. It was an ambitious project that wasn't finished in the artist's lifetime. Today it has some 40 buildings, many with medieval origins, and the oldest from 1237. Zorn's passion for collecting gradually led to the thoughts about a museum in Mora. The idea was realized after his death by his wife, who established a museum alongside the Zorn house in 1939. Here Zorn's own work was exhibited beside objects from his collections. During his last decade, Zorn endured plenty of criticism. He was seen by many as the painter of the establishment, the portraitist of wholesalers, and his nudes seemed more and more an expression of carnal lust. Personally, he felt his creativity was not longer the same, and a contributing factor was his worsening health, partly due to his tremendously intense way of life. Self-portrait in a wolf-skin coat from 1915 shows an aged and exhausted man, and yet, to the very last, he could create small masterpieces, such as the statuette The Broken Pot. A friend of Zorn has described how the artist tenderly and sadly sat and caressed the figure. Quote, "There was something touching about this, his last work, because I guessed it was his final piece, and I think he knew it too. So young and chaste and naive in its living form, and the discreet, tranquil symbolism. The genius of his youth was with him once again, and he held it in his tired, trembling hands." End quote. Shortly thereafter, in August 1920, Zorn passed away, 60 years old, in Mora Hospital. He was survived by his wife for 2 decades. Zorn succeeded in acquiring a considerable wealth. As he and his wife never had any children, they gave almost their entire fortune to the Swedish state, including more than 60 buildings and some 20,000 objects. The donation, called the Zorn Collections, includes the Zorn Museum, which today not only shows Zorn's works, but also offers several special exhibitions annually. The Zorn House, where guided tours are given 362 days per year. His Wilderness Studio and the Open Air Museum. Here at the Open Air Museum, we are celebrating Children's Midsummer every summer. Ever since the Zorn Collections opened 70 years ago, it has been among the most beloved and respected art institutions in Sweden, with about 65,000 visitors every year. The interest and view of Zorn has varied greatly throughout the years. Certain periods he and his work have been seen with great esteem, and other times taken more for granted. Among artists, however, he has always been admired and thought of as the painter's painter. Today, we note a greater interest in his work, not at least from foreign museums. Many of the guests at the Mora Museum are also foreign tourists. Having said that, I would like to end by inviting you all to Mora, where it is tradition of ours to always warmly welcome our friends of America. Thank you.